Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. The White House says President Donald Trump hasn't set a deadline for receiving a proposal from Iran, rejecting reports of a 3 to 5 day deadline, and adding that he is not rushing talks with Iran. Iran attacked 3 ships in the Strait of Hormuz and seized 2 of the ships, tightening its grip again on shipping in the critical oil supply choke point. Washington, however, said the action does not violate the current truce, noting the vessels were not American or Israeli. South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung, who's visiting Hanoi, met with Vietnam's top leader To Lam and agreed to cooperate on energy and supply chains amid heightened global uncertainties. The United States is holding off on setting a deadline for Iran talks, even as pressure mounts through a continued naval blockade and growing risks in the Strait of Hormuz. Our Muniran starts us off.
The White House says President Donald Trump is in no rush to lock in a timeline for negotiations with Iran, despite reports suggesting otherwise. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters on Wednesday there is no firm deadline for Tehran to submit what the U.S. has called a unified proposal, dismissing claims of a 3 to 5 day window as inaccurate.
The president has not set a deadline himself. Ultimately, he will dictate the timetable.
According to Fox News, Trump has also rejected the idea of any time pressure, saying the ceasefire extension will remain in place as long as needed while talks continue. Instead, officials say the timeline will ultimately be determined by the president, as Washington waits for clarity from what it describes as a divided Iranian leadership, split between pragmatists and hardliners. While direct military strikes have paused under the ceasefire, the broader pressure campaign has not. The White House says its naval blockade and economic measures remain fully in force, targeting Iran's oil exports and shipping routes. Leavitt described the blockade as a key source of leverage, claiming it is inflicting significant economic damage and limiting Iran's ability to move oil through its main export hub. Even as negotiations stall, U.S. officials argue this strategy is strengthening their position, with Trump reportedly viewing the ongoing economic squeeze as more effective than continued bombardment. But beneath the diplomatic standoff, a more complex and potentially long-lasting challenge is emerging in the Strait of Hormuz. According to the Washington Post, Pentagon officials have warned lawmakers that clearing sea mines laid by Iran could take up to 6 months and may not even begin until the war formally ends. The report, based on a classified congressional briefing, suggests more than 20 mines may have been deployed, some using GPS technology that makes them harder to detect. That assessment raises concerns that disruptions to one of the world's most critical oil routes could persist well beyond any ceasefire agreement. 문혜련, Arirang News.
Iran has escalated tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, firing on commercial vessels and seizing 2 ships, in a move that underscores growing risks to global shipping. The incident comes despite an extended ceasefire announced by U.S. President Donald Trump, as Tehran signals both defiance at sea and apparent openness to diplomacy. Our Lee Soo-jin has more.
Iran on Wednesday fired on 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and seized 2 of them, marking a sharp escalation in tensions along one of the world's most critical shipping routes. The attacks happened just a day after U.S. President Donald Trump extended a ceasefire while keeping an American naval blockade on Iranian ports in place. Iranian state media said the country's Revolutionary Guard is now escorting the seized ships into Iranian waters. The White House, however, said the action does not violate the current truce, noting the vessels were not American or Israeli. The latest incident adds to a growing pattern of maritime aggression. Since the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran began in late February, there have been more than 30 reported attacks on ships in the region. Prior to that, the Strait of Hormuz had remained open to international traffic. Despite the escalation, Iranian's President Masoud Pezeshkian signaled openness to diplomacy. In a social media post on Wednesday, he said Iran remains committed to resolving disputes through dialogue, but criticized what he called breaches of commitments and ongoing blockades, accusing Washington of contradictory actions. Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf also weighed in, saying a meaningful ceasefire cannot exist alongside maritime restrictions or continued military operations by Israel. He warned that the vital waterway could remain closed if ceasefire violations continue, raising concerns about further disruption to global energy supplies and trade. 이수진, Arirang News.
Over in Hanoi, President Lee Jae-myung and Vietnam's top leader, To Lam, have held talks amid heightened global uncertainties. Cooperation on energy and railway projects topped the agenda. Our correspondent Yoon Jang-min reports from Hanoi.
President Lee Jae-myung, who is on a state visit to Hanoi, was given a red carpet welcome by To Lam, Vietnam's top political leader. The friendly mood was reflected in Wednesday's summit.
당 서기장께서는 지난해 우리 정부 출범 후에 첫 번째 국빈으로 방한하셨고 또 이번 저의 베트남 방문은 베트남의 새 지도부 출범 후 2주 만에 이루어진 베트남의 첫 국빈 방문으로.
Your visit, Mr. President, clearly shows our comprehensive strategic partnership that is based upon strong, effective, and deep trust.
Amid the current tensions in the Middle East, the Korean president said Korea and Vietnam will work together on energy and infrastructure based on profound mutual trust.
최근 중동 상황에서 비롯된 공급망 불안정성 속에서 양국 간 협력의 필요성이 더욱 커졌다는 데 공감하였습니다. 에너지 안보 강화와 공급망 안정을 위해 더욱 긴밀히 협력하기로.
A dozen MOUs were signed on energy, infrastructure, and technology, including power infrastructure and nuclear power plants.
Vietnam welcomes Korean companies expanding investment in areas such as infrastructure, smart cities, semiconductors, large-scale AI data centers, nuclear power plants, smart ports, and next-generation ports.
The two countries plan to cooperate on the Ho Chi Minh City Metro Railway, with South Korea's Hyundai Rotem set to play a major part in this $110 million project. Korean firms are also eyeing urban development and airport projects in Vietnam. By 2030, Seoul and Hanoi aim to expand their annual bilateral trade to $150 billion. The two countries signed an MOU to allow exports of heat-treated poultry products, to expand cooperation on agricultural and food products. People-to-people exchanges was also on the agenda.
상대국 국민과 다문화 가정의 안정적인 체류와 권익 증진을 위해 긴밀하게 협력해 나가기로 하였습니다.
We also have agreed to share experiences on culture and entertainment industries, such as film, music, and gaming, and bolster mutual support.
It was the two leaders' second engagement in about 8 months, following the Vietnamese leader's trip to Korea last August.
The South Korean president's reciprocal visit to Vietnam so early in his presidency is seen as carrying symbolic significance in terms of Seoul's strategic priorities. Yoon Jang-min, Arirang News, Hanoi.
So the leaders of South Korea and Vietnam met in Hanoi and agreed to cooperate on energy and supply chains. For more, we're joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Kalimak, Assistant Professor of Global Business Administration at Kyongsung University. Professor Kalimak, thanks for coming on today.
Hello, good morning.
So President Lee Jae-myung became the first state guest under Vietnam's new leadership. What does this timing signal, and what do you make of yesterday's summit between President Lee and Vietnam's top leader?
Oh, yeah, the fact that President Lee is the first head of state guest under Vietnam's new leadership, President and General Secretary To Lam, this rather shows more than just a ceremonial act. I see this as a symbolic positioning because it signals that Seoul is being prioritized as a foundational partner in Hanoi's new era and future. And with regards to the summit yesterday, my take on that is it wasn't just about optics. It was about setting the tone for a recalibrated regional order, especially that countries recently are akin to moving towards fragmentation, meaning kind of less integration sort of globalization. This scenario is analogous to Vietnam, saying that their next chapter begins with Korea at the table. Putting Korea at the forefront sends a strategic message to both Beijing and Washington. And because normally it's rare for a middle power like Korea to be the opening act, I would say, in another country's leadership transition, thereby this only shows Seoul's rising diplomatic weight and role.
I see. And this trip included both Vietnam and India, as the administration has been emphasizing what it calls global South diplomacy. So why are diplomatic ties with these two countries, Vietnam and India, so important for South Korea right now?
Well, President Lee's visits are about pragmatic and targeted diplomacy. Each country was chosen for a specific strategic reason, and I would say that Vietnam and India are not random choices, but instead they are anchor states in the global South. Together, they represent nearly 1.6 billion people and economies growing at 6 to 7% annually. For Korea, this is about hedging against geopolitical risk. India is the world's fastest growing major economy, targeted or projected to surpass Germany and Japan in GDP by the early 2030s. Vietnam is the fastest growing economy in ASEAN, and so by deepening ties with Vietnam and India, Korea is essentially building a South-South corridor that that diversifies beyond the U.S.-China binary. As I mentioned earlier, countries are gearing towards fragmented world, and as a result, it is creating new and more sustainable alliances, taking into consideration the risk that the two powerful countries have impacted the world, especially the economy. Apparently, South Korea, with its new role and influence vis-a-vis significance, it's a bold attempt to reposition Korea as a bridge nation between advanced economies and emerging powers.
Right, you just mentioned Vietnam has a very fast-growing economy, and Vietnam was actually South Korea's third largest trading partner last year after China and the United States. So what's driving this strong trade partnership? And as global supply chains shift, how important is Vietnam to South Korea's efforts to reduce reliance on China?
Yes, you're right. Vietnam is actually the centerpiece of Korea's ASEAN ties. And as you mentioned, it is its largest trade partner. Last year, bilateral trade hit nearly $80 billion, making Vietnam more important to Korea than Japan in trade terms. So what's driving this? I can mention two things. First is supply chain realignment. Korean firms are shifting production from China to Vietnam. In fact, over 40% of Samsung's smartphones are now assembled in Vietnam. And second is demographics. Vietnam's median age is just 32, giving Korea access to young, tech-savvy workforce. Also, take into account the migration diaspora between South Korea and Vietnam. Vietnam has the biggest Korean community in ASEAN, and on the other hand, Vietnam is the second largest group of diaspora in Korea. As global supply chains fragment, Vietnam is Korea's China plus one strategy in action. It's not just about reducing reliance on China, it's about creating a parallel hub that can absorb shocks from the US-China tensions. In strategic terms, Vietnam is becoming Korea's second factory floor.
Right, I see. And a large business delegation is also accompanying President Lee Jae-myung on this trip, including the heads of South Korea's major firms like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and SK. So what makes Vietnam such an attractive market for Korean firms, and what are these companies hoping to achieve from this visit?
Yeah, President Lee went to Vietnam and India with the conglomerates. So the presence of Samsung, LG, Hyundai, and SK is very telling. They're not just chasing cheap labor; they are chasing market depth. And Vietnam's middle class is expected to double by 2030, reaching nearly 50 million consumers. For Samsung, it's about consolidating Vietnam as its global production base. For Hyundai, it's about tapping into Southeast Asia's booming demand for electric vehicles. For SK and LG, it's about energy and digital infrastructure. But all of these mentioned conglomerates, what they hope to achieve is, again, twofold. Number one is lock in Vietnam as a strategic hub for manufacturing and research and development. And second, It shapes the rules of the game in Vietnam's next phase of industrial policy. In short, Korean companies see Vietnam not just as a market, but I would say, a launchpad for the wider ASEAN region.
I see. All right, Professor Kalama, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thank you. South Korea's economy grew at its fastest pace in 5.5 years during the first quarter, overcoming downward pressures from the recent conflict in the Middle East. The Bank of Korea announced its advanced estimate on Thursday, saying that real gross domestic product increased by 1.7% in the first quarter compared to the previous quarter. That's nearly double the central bank's earlier forecast of 0.9%. Exports surged 5.1%, led by information technology products such as semiconductors. This added 1.1 percentage points to the overall economic growth. Domestic demand added 0.6 percentage points to the GDP. Facilities investment climbed 4.8%, while construction investment rose 2.8%. Gross domestic income surged 7.5% on quarter, the highest increase since the first quarter of 1988, indicating a significant increase in the nation's purchasing power. And South Korean chipmaker SK hynix hit new highs across all major performance indicators in the first quarter of 2026. The company announced this morning that its operating profit stood at around $25.4 billion, up nearly fivefold from a year earlier and more than double the previous quarter. Revenue also hit a new high, nearly tripling to about $35.5 billion. Those figures helped push the company's operating profit margin to a record 72%, up from 58% in the previous quarter. SK hynix attributed the strong performance to surging demand for artificial intelligence memory chips, along with increased sales of high-end products like HBM and high-capacity server DRAM modules. South Korea and the United States are aiming to complete conditions for transferring wartime operations control to Seoul by early 2029. Speaking at a congressional hearing in Washington on Wednesday, U.S. Forces Korea Commander General Xavier Brunson said both sides are targeting the first quarter of that year to meet the requirements for the long-planned handover. The transition is based on specific conditions, including South Korea's ability to lead combined forces, strengthen strike and air defense capabilities, and a stable regional security environment. The push comes as President Lee Jae-myung's administration seeks to regain wartime command before the end of its term in 2030. There is a new racket sport that's gaining interest from both the young and old. Pickleball is quickly establishing itself as a new form of leisure and is gaining ground worldwide. And amid this global trend, Korea is also seeing a sharp rise in the number of enthusiasts. Our correspondent Cho Young-eun tells us more.
It looks a bit like tennis and a bit like badminton. At this outdoor court, people are picking up paddles to hit a lightweight plastic ball punctured with holes. They're playing what is known as pickleball. Though still unfamiliar to some, pickleball is a sport that combines elements of tennis, badminton, and table tennis. It can be played both indoors and outdoors on a badminton-sized court with a slightly lower net. This pickleball is lightweight and holding a paddle is simple. Grab the handle naturally, form a V with your thumb and index finger, and use a forehand drive, similar to tennis. Each rally begins with an underhand serve below the waist, and games are typically played to 11 points. Simplicity is its biggest appeal. With short games and easy-to-learn rules, this sport has a low barrier to entry, making it accessible to everyone from children to seniors.
I think the most appealing part is that once you learn the basic rules, anyone can easily jump into a game. I play almost every day of the week.
I had been doing other sports for over 10 years, but I got injured, so I started looking for alternatives. I came across pickleball. I saw that it's very popular in the US, and I've been playing it for about a year and a half now.
And once one person starts playing, they inevitably invite their friends too.
So my wife is Korean, and her friend was playing pickleball here, and then my wife's friend got my wife into pickleball, so now I'm into pickleball. And, you know, we have $200 pickleball paddle later, here I am.
Since its first creation in the USA in 1965, pickleball has surged in popularity in the United States in recent years. In Korea, momentum is building just as quickly following the official launch of the Korea Pickleball Association. The sport's base has expanded within months. New facilities are also emerging, including a recently opened complex at Gwangnam-do Hangang Park in Seoul, featuring 14 dedicated pickleball courts.
At first, many in their 60s and older couldn't even go to the market or ride a bike because their legs hurt. But after playing pickleball for 2 to 3 years, they say they can now walk to shop and visit stores again. Hearing this is incredibly rewarding.
As Korea moves towards becoming a super-age society, sports like pickleball could become a meaningful alternative for leisure and welfare. 조영은, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon on Wednesday killed at least 5 people, including a journalist, in the deadliest day since a 10-day ceasefire took effect. Lebanese journalist Amal Khalil was killed when rescuers were blocked from reaching her after strikes hit the buildings she had taken cover in. Lebanon's prime minister called the obstruction of rescue efforts, quote, war crimes. Israel denied blocking any rescue operation and said it had targeted cars that had left a Hezbollah military structure. Lebanon's president said Thursday's talks with Israel will push for a ceasefire extension beyond its Sunday expiry. In the UK, any child aged 17 or younger today will never legally be able to buy a cigarette for the rest of their lives. UK lawmakers passed a landmark law on Wednesday that raises the legal smoking age by 1 year every year. This means anyone born on or after January 1st, 2009 faces a lifetime ban on purchasing tobacco. The law also bans vaping and nicotine product sales to under 18s and tightens advertising rules. The government says smoking kills around 64,000 people a year in England alone and costs the National Health Service £3 billion each year. The United States is expected to reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug. The decision at a federal level would reclassify cannabis at the same level as common painkillers. This follows an executive order signed by President Trump in December directing the loosening of federal marijuana regulations. Cannabis firms will also see lower tax burdens and find it easier to secure funding. Shares of major cannabis companies surged as much as 23% on the news. A crypto billionaire has taken the Trump family's digital currency company to federal court, claiming it secretly locked him out of his own holdings and threatened to wipe them out entirely. Justin Sun, founder of the Tron cryptocurrency, put $45 million into World Liberty Financial, a venture co-founded by President Trump and his sons. His lawsuit claims the company blocked him from selling his tokens, stripped him from voting rights, and embedded hidden tools to freeze or permanently delete holdings without cause. World Liberty CEO Zach Witkoff called the claims entirely without merit.
The dust has finally cleared and blue skies are making a welcome comeback today. Across the inner regions, the sunshine will take over, bringing a fresh and comfortable spring day. Meanwhile, along the south coast, a few showers may linger through the morning, but Jeju-do Island could see rain into the afternoon with up to 20 millimeters in the forecast. While the skies look pleasant, the air is becoming quite dry across Gangwon-do province and the east of Gyeongsang-Pukdo province. Dry weather combined with gusty winds can quickly raise wildfire danger, so use extra caution with anything that could start a fire. And this afternoon, Seoul and Gwangju will be getting up to 23 degrees Celsius, Daegu at 20 degrees. Then we'll have sunny and warmer than average temperatures through the weekend, with pleasant spring weather continuing across much of the country. Meanwhile, big gaps in readings will continue, so a light jacket remains a wise choice.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.